Welcome to another episode of Jackman Radio. I'm your host, Mike Jackman, and I'm very excited tonight to be joined by Mr. Jefferson Morley. Jefferson Morley is currently the editor of JFK Facts on Substack, and formerly an editor and a journalist with the Washington Post, as well as the author of 3 books on the CIA. Jeff, how you doing tonight?
I'm good. It's great to be here, Mike.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. Really excited to have you, and I know we kind of have a hard out around 8, so I want to be respectful of your time. So, just going right into it, a lot of our audience is familiar with the JFK assassination. I've had on other folks, but you recently did an event, I think, on your YouTube or through your Substack, where you talked about the pre-assassination file that the CIA had on Oswald. Do you care to go into that a little bit and some of the importance?
Yeah. So, here's the thing, Mike. The JFK story, it's of continuing interest, right? And people poo-poo conspiracy theories and say there's nothing there, but somehow it never goes away. And, President Trump has been talking about it. RFK Jr. has been talking about it. We'll get to that. But, the point is, we've learned a lot in recent years. And I think this is the thing that people don't really know because the mainstream media doesn't really want to report on it. It's not a priority amid all of our partisan warfare. But, we've learned a lot about JFK in recent years. And it occurred to me when last summer of 2023, actually, when the CIA's pre-assassination file on Lee Harvey Oswald, the man accused of killing President Kennedy, it wasn't until April of 2023 that file was fully declassified. Okay, so we're talking about the information that the Central Intelligence Agency had on the man who supposedly killed the president before the president was killed, while the president was still alive. And so when that one name was removed, was unredacted in April 2023. And so with that, we could finally see the Oswald file, what the CIA had on Oswald before President Kennedy was assassinated in its entirety. Well, first of all, the fact that it took 61 years to declassify a file on a man who is often described as a lone nut, that seems like a contradiction in terms, right? If he's such a lone nut, such an outlier, what's so secret about what's going on? Well, what was so secret was actually highly significant, okay? And it was so significant that when I broke the story in JFK Facts, the New York Times picked up on it, okay? And the story that I reported and that the Times picked up on was that when President Kennedy was alive and in the White House, a CIA operations officer named Reuben Efron was reading the mail of Lee Harvey Oswald, the man who allegedly killed the president. So the CIA was reading the mail of the man who killed the president, right? That was a very interesting revelation because we never knew the name of that man for 60 plus years, right? So, that is a significant revelation in and of itself. Now, people say, oh, well, that's not smoking gun proof of a conspiracy. No, nobody said it was. But it is smoking gun proof that the story we've been told is not true. Okay, the story that one guy came out of nowhere and killed the president, that's not true. Oswald was very well known to the CIA and to top officials in the CIA right before President Kennedy was killed. So that's, that was the thing that I reported on. That was the findings. It was a very interesting exercise, Mike. I taught a class in the Oswald file because I thought this was so interesting. So I pulled all the information together, and the CIA, it was actually a lot of information. The CIA had 42 documents on Oswald in their one file before President Kennedy was killed, 180 pages of material. So I taught a course in this. So I talked about the file, what we know about it, where it came from, who's figured in it, who created it, why, and all of that. But it was also crowdsourcing, right? I had a lot of people. We had 50 plus people. And, and a bunch of people in the class really applied themselves, and we tried to extract new data from the file. So, for example, the 181 pages. That's never been reported before. I never knew it, but in the class, people counted up, and that was the solid finding of the group, 181 pages. And so we really gained a lot of new insight into what the CIA knew about Oswald. So what does it mean? Is it smoking gun proof of conspiracy? No, but I mean, it's an incredible story of negligence. I mean, how could it be that top CIA officials knew about the man who was going to kill the president and did nothing? And we never knew this story until 60 years later. I mean, come on. That's important. That's significant. So when people say, oh, what's in the latest JFK files? What's Trump going to do? The most important thing that I say is, well, let's understand what we've learned already, right? Which is the official story that one guy came out of nowhere and killed the president. That's not true, okay? He didn't come out of nowhere. He was well known to top CIA officials. And we can name them. And if you go to JFK Facts and you look up the stories that we have on Lee Harvey Oswald, these officials are named senior CIA operations officers in late 1963, know all about the guy who supposedly killed the president. So it just raises a lot of questions. Now, what's my theory? You know what, Mike? I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't have a theory, okay? It's the government's job to make all these records public, right? There's no reason to keep any secrets about this. And yet we find ourselves in a situation where the CIA is keeping lots of secrets. So that's the current reality that we're in. And so what I say at JFK Facts is, this is a live story. We don't have a good explanation of what happened in 1963. And somehow people still care about this. It's still relevant to our politics. That's why Trump's talking about it. That's why RFK is talking about it. That's why Biden issued an order about it. It's like, it's not something that happened way in the past. It's something that is also somehow present in our conversations today.
Yeah, President Biden did a couple of interesting things pertaining to the Kennedy assassination I want to get to in a sec. But first, I just wanted to touch on that fellow there, Ephraim, the guy who was, he was opening Oswald's mail. Was he not also opening Marguerite Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, and her mail? Or the CIA was certainly looking at her mail as well.
Yeah. So the way it worked was there was a program called Lingual. HT Lingual was the code name. And this was created by James Angleton, the counterintelligence chief of the CIA. And what the Lingual program did was it developed a list of people who they wanted to open the mail of, the international mail. And they had an office at the International Postal Facility in Queens, New York. And so all outgoing mail going to Europe or, the Soviet Union or anywhere goes through that facility. So the CIA had an office there, and they would look at every envelope that came through. And they had a list of names. And when they saw a name on the list appear in the letters, they pulled that letter out, they steamed it open, they took out the letter, they copied the letter, they put the letter back in the envelope, resealed it, and sent it on its way. And then they filed that correspondence, so they knew they intercepted the mail. So Oswald, from November 1959 on, is on the Lingual watch list. Okay, and it's a pretty, it's kind of a distinction. I mean, there was only a couple hundred names on that list. So in the entire universe of Americans, 150 million Americans at that point, the utterly unknown Lee Harvey Oswald is already on the collection requirements of a top secret CIA program. And that's not, none of this is open to any doubt. Okay.
Right.
So that's what's going on right from the start. Now, so your question was,
they were also looking, because obviously if Lee's correspondence was coming from Russia or when he was in Japan, they're going to look at that. But he was in Japan before Russia, obviously.
Yeah, no, and the letter the document that was declassified in April 2023 was a letter from Marguerite Oswald to Lee. Lee had gone to the Soviet Union without telling her anything, and she was terribly worried about her son. She knew he'd gone there, but he wasn't writing, he wasn't doing anything. And then in July of 1961, he finally wrote to her and said, "I'm going to marry a Russian girl, And so the letter that they intercepted was Marguerite's letter back to Lee saying, oh, good, I'm glad you're okay. Can I send you something? That sort of thing. Just a mother's letter to a son. Right. But that's the kind of granular knowledge that they were seeking about Lee Oswald. They wanted to know, why do you intercept somebody's mail? Because you want to know about their personal life, right? You want to understand what's going on with them privately. So from November 1959 to November 1963, the CIA, top CIA officials, are very interested in Lee Oswald's personal life. And that's that's a story that I told really for the first time. I mean, John Newman and other people have written about this, and very important work. I follow in there, but this is a developed story that this is true, that these top CIA officials were watching Oswald.
And it's one, unfortunately, you don't hear about a ton. Obviously, you mentioned the New York Times picked up on the some of your work with JFK Facts. And then, of course, last year when Paul Landis came out with his book, the former Secret Service agent, kind of altering his story or adding something to it that hadn't been there before about recovering a whole bullet. But just on Marguerite Oswald, really quickly before we pivot, she did come out very early and say that she believed that her son was an agent of the U.S. government or intelligence. And there's a press conference, I'm sure you've seen it, where she's asked about it. And she's like, well, I don't have the proof, or I can't show it to you right now. But I mean, she was at least in 63 or 64 was publicly saying that. So
yes. Yeah, no. And at the time people said, oh, lady, you're crazy. Who would
right.
Who could possibly be interested in your pathetic loser of a son? And she was absolutely right. Only top CIA officials were interested in him. So, yeah, very good point. Very good point.
Yeah, and obviously, I think she may have sold some stories or agreed to talk to certain publications for a fee, and she was made picked at for that. But I mean, just think of think of that situation she was in where her son's accused suddenly, and then he's killed on television, and it all happens over the course of a weekend. So, yeah, I can only imagine what that was like for her. But back to the Biden point. So he actually, I believe, pardoned or cleared Abraham Bolden's name legally for what happened with him. He was a Secret Service agent. During Biden's term, he did that, and then of course Biden essentially kicked the files back to the CIA, correct? And they don't ever have to release them.
So the first point that you mentioned, Biden pardoned Abraham Bolden, Secret Service agent who reported on deficiencies in Kennedy's security detail in 1963. First African-American Secret Service agent. And for his trouble, for his professionalism, he was framed by J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI and wound up spending time in jail, completely unwarranted, and clearly punishment for the fact that he wanted to talk about, first of all, the plot against President Kennedy's life in Chicago 3 weeks before Dallas, and also the lax behavior of Secret Service agents in the Kennedy detail. So that was a very good thing that Bolden did. I always thought it was shameful that Barack Obama didn't do that. But Joe Biden, to his credit, did do it. Biden also, as you said, ceded control of the rest of the JFK files to the CIA and the National Security Agency. And this is recorded in a memo that he issued on June 30th, 2023, in which he endorsed these CIA transparency plan. So the CIA came forward and said, look, we'll take care of the rest of these documents. We have a schedule here. We have a transparency plan for you. So when the CIA comes to you and says they have a transparency plan, you put your hand on your wallet, right? Because there's about to be a trick that's pulled. And sure enough, the CIA's transparency plans are designed to prevent JFK transparency indefinitely. So it's a very Orwellian formulation. But under the plans that Biden approved in 2023, the CIA and the NSA now control the release or decisions about the release of the rest of the JFK records that are in the JFK collection, which is a lot of records, 3,600 plus records. And so the way things stand right now, those documents will stay secret indefinitely. There's no schedule for their release. There's no reason for them to be released. There's no mandatory. And here's the thing, Mike. Here's the thing, right? Congress passed a law in 1992, and they said, we got to get to the bottom of this JFK thing. We're not going to make up our minds. We're not going to investigate again. We're just going to make everything public and let the people decide for themselves. Okay. It's a commonsensical solution to a very controversial issue. Okay. And so they say, and CIA and all these people, they have their concerns. They don't want to release things. Okay. We'll take that into account. And, if there's a living agent, we won't release their name. They were very careful in that regard to respect the wishes of the CIA. But the law was very clear. At the end of 25 years, everything should be released, whether it involved names of agents or whatever, after 25 years, except in the rarest of circumstances, this Congress said, okay? So with that, the CIA and the FBI withheld 15,000 documents, or parts of 15,000 documents, okay? Except in the rarest of cases. So in the judgment of the FBI and the CIA, 15,000 is the rarest of cases. Okay? And that was 7 years ago, and they didn't release it. Now, to their credit, and I want to be very clear, both President Biden and President Trump, while they acquiesced to the CIA and the FBI on these, they also released lots of documents.
They did. So, I give them both credit for that.
Yeah. So the 15,000 number that was in 2017, as best we can tell now, is about 3,600. Okay. But it's still 3,600 records that they are declaring unilaterally. So we're going on 8 years past the statutory deadline. And they're still saying, no, we don't have to release this. Go away. There's nothing here. I mean, come on. This is very bizarre and suspicious behavior.
It makes them look worse. It makes them look even worse.
No, and it's self-evident. It's self-evident that they're not acting in good faith. They're not even trying to act in good faith.
No.
And so so Trump comes along and he says he's going to release them. He's promised this before, and he, found a reason to break his promise. And the way things look right now, I think that's the most likely outcome again.
You think so? Because I remember I was excited in 2017. He's like, at long last, all the files are going to come out. It's going to be beautiful. We're going to release all of them, and he's talking about Ted Cruz's father. He's having brunch with Lee Harvey Oswald. Can you believe it? I heard that it was Vice President Pence and Pompeo that actually convinced Trump not to release all of them.
Yeah, no, I mean, the best news accounts that we have, we have a couple of different sources. Reuters at the time, the wire service reported that it was Pompeo and Wray who had prevailed on them. And then what Tucker Carlson and some other people have said, and Trump himself, Pompeo made the recommendation. Trump didn't name names, but he said, people you'd like, like
they're really good people, Jeff. Okay,
yeah,
they're really good. They just want to
cover.
They want to cover up assassinations, but they're good people.
Yeah. So good people, and at the end of the day, right? Trump will always, since he's a transactional guy, he'll always trade JFK files for something else, right?
Sure.
That satisfies, his need to dominate the news cycle. So, and RFK, it's interesting, RFK, I think we see signs that he tried to do something this week, which was he was putting forward his daughter-in-law, Amaryllis Fox, a former CIA officer, up for a senior position at the CIA with the idea that she would be the point person at getting to the bottom of the JFK assassination. This is what RFK told Senate sources earlier this week when he was kind of making the rounds on Capitol Hill. Well, that idea was shot down definitively, like within 24 hours.
Yeah.
Tom Cotton was opposed to it. It seems to be dead as doornails. RFK isn't talking about it. And I think, RFK has his own nomination to worry about. And so, he's just going to have to swallow this. And Amaryllis Fox is not going to be able to do that. So I think that's an early sign of where the political realities of the JFK files.
Do you
live.
think she could still do National Security Council, maybe, or some other position, or?
Well, I mean, the point is, it will take somebody with a senior bureaucratic position, right? Which means you're in the paper flow, you're in the loop of all decision making, and somebody who's in that process understands that process and is going to work that process and make sure that everybody, gets on the same page and releases this material. So it's a job. I mean, it's a serious job. Now, Amaryllis Fox, having worked in the CIA, could probably do that, but it would take somebody experienced in intelligence operations to do that. And, I'm not sure RFK is going to be able to get that, or that Trump has any commitment to having somebody like that inside his government. You're seeing this struggle within the Trump coalition between the hawks and the, what we would say America First people, right? The non-interventionist people, the Trump people who say we don't want any part of these foreign wars, and the hawks, Marco Rubio, and those people who say, we have to fight for freedom, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so those factions around Trump are, struggling for primacy. But on national security stuff, I feel like the hawks are going to win, and JFK, full disclosure, is going to go by the boards. That's my feeling right now.
What do you think about John Ratcliffe?
You think I think Ratcliffe is going to be like Pompeo. He's going to want to go along with the CIA staff, which is going to be very opposed to releasing this type of material.
Yeah, well, I was excited over the summer when RFK Jr. endorsed President Trump. I think it was out in Arizona, and he said, in honor of Bobby, we're gonna open up a commission, we're gonna release the files. And you would think himself, having been shot in the head, in the ear, and then another attempt, that I really think that awakened a stirring in him, because I know deep down, Trump loves a good conspiracy, and I obviously that word is a pejorative when you're talking about the Kennedy assassination, but I really do think he's curious. And it's interesting because he said to Judge Napolitano, you wouldn't have released him if you saw what I saw, indicating it was scary. But then he just said to Joe Rogan before the election that it was like benign and it's nothing major. So it's like, obviously he engages in hyperbole and a lot of bluster.
No, and you've isolated his two statements there, which can't be reconciled. And so my feeling personally, my reaction to the comments to Judge Napolitano was that was just bluster. I mean, if Trump had if he knew something that would give him an advantage over the CIA and make his enemies at the CIA look bad, why wouldn't he put it out there? It would be very unlike Trump not to put it out there. So my conclusion is he was just blowing smoke,
obviously he hasn't really read too deeply into it.
And that's the other thing is,
I don't think he has, but I think he's got questions about it, and I think
and the reason why I hope, and maybe it was foolish, was say what you will about Trump, but he does have an acute political antennae. He
does,
and I thought it was interesting that he brought up the JFK files. It's kind of like his closing argument, that broadcast that he did with Joe Rogan right at the end. It's like, you're at the home stretch, Harris and Trump, they're going to be like refining and trying to state it as concisely as possible. Why should I be president? Trump plays the JFK card in there, which I think was,
he does,
based on polls, that's the majoritarian position. That's a winning, in terms of public opinion, that's a winning position. So, he took that, and I think that speaks to his political instincts that, this is significant to people and it's to my advantage to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of share your sentiments, Jeff, about the likelihood of it coming out, but for now I have to be at 50-50. I still have to have some hope that, they are going to be released. And look, Bobby can only use as much political capital as he can, and obviously, like we said, Amaryllis is not going to be deputy director of the CIA. But I still think that, especially if you look at public opinion polls, you look at the will of the people, you look at a lot of MAGA voters, they want to see all that stuff come out. So there was a clear mandate that most people who voted in this election are interested. And
and that's, that's a political reality, and
there's a lot of heat on it.
Yeah. So, and we'll see how that plays out in the second Trump administration. And, does Bobby Kennedy, gain a significant role, and, where President Trump wants to follow his lead on this issue? Can they get somebody into, if not a confirmation position, a bureaucratically central point, like you said, National Security Council? These decisions about, these documents are funneled through the National Security Council, who then puts forward, they'll send a memo to the president, and it will say, here's your choices. A, release them all. B, release some of them. C, release none of them. Something like that. That's how presidents make decisions, is they get handed, the synthesized choices of what the bureaucracy sees as, what does the president have to decide? So, the fact that it's in play, and I think, it was easy for Trump to break his promise last time. Another tweet. This thing he did with Rogan and RFK, he's a little more on the line, and he loses more face. And that's another thing Trump's acute at. He doesn't want to lose face with his followers. So he's bet some money on this thing. It's harder for him to walk away from his promises now. So when you say you try to remain optimistic, that's one thing that I take away from this. I'm not optimistic in general, but there's more reason for him to follow through now than there was before, just in terms of transactional Trump logic,
Yeah, but I mean, this still must be quite a thing for you to see, Jeff, because you've been at this for a long time, and you actually sued the CIA back in 2003 about one officer, right, that was involved, or one high-ranking figure. And before you go into that, I just want to ask also, with the files, is there still an entire file on like Bill Harvey or Joe Anides or one of these guys that's completely blacked out, that hasn't come out yet, that they were even trying to get out like during the House Select Committee?
You're asking a very specific question. Bill Harvey, for people who don't know, was the chief of the CIA's assassination program, ZR Rifle, from 1960 to 1963, a man who hated President Kennedy and opposed his policies, and is considered, a possible suspect in a Kennedy assassination conspiracy. Most of the Bill Harvey material has been released. And I mean, there's another thing that's like what we've learned in recent years. What we've gotten Bill Harvey's notes. This is a guy who plans assassinations, and he wrote his notes about how you plan an assassination. And he talked about his contacts in the Corsican mafia and that sort of thing. But at one point he says, well, and if things go wrong, what you do is you blame a communist, which is exactly what happened in the Kennedy assassination. It was blamed on a communist. So, that kind of detail that we've learned, that's the way Bill Harvey thought. And that's, that
a communist.
Yeah. That speaks to the JFK story as we know it. And we know something new that we didn't know before. George Joanides, he was the chief of covert action in the Miami station. So he's running undercover operations in Miami, and turns out, and in New Orleans. And there's a big file on him. His personnel file is still largely redacted, even from the years 1963, 64, when his own agents had contact with Oswald, repeated contact with Oswald.
That was the Amspel one, right? The Amspel
being
run.
He was running a propaganda and political operation. George Joanides was operating a political action and propaganda program in South Florida, funding an anti-Castro student group called the Cuban Student Directorate, and the code name was Amspel. And in the summer of 1963, the Amspel network, the Amspel delegation in New Orleans, publicized the pro-Castro political activities of this unknown man named Lee Harvey Oswald. So it turns out that group was sponsored by the CIA, something that was never disclosed before. So this is what they're sitting on, and what they're sitting on is a very, it's very difficult to tell, like what was going on, what's the explanation here. But we know that the explanation is relevant, and we know they don't want to give one. So they're covering up. That's what we can tell. That's what we have proof positive of. They're hiding relevant information about the man who supposedly killed President Kennedy 61 going on 62 years later. So what does that tell you?
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned Harvey talking about blaming it on a communist. I think Oswald's brother Robert, who maintained throughout his life that he thought that his brother, was responsible, even said that his favorite show was I Led Three Lives, which was a show in the 50s about a guy infiltrating a communist plot on behalf of the government and posing as a communist. So I always thought that was interesting.
Yeah, no, and that is, so this figure of Lee Harvey Oswald is, of great historic interest, and his personality characteristics. He was a bit of a schemer. He did like to infiltrate. He was sincerely left-wing, kind of progressive in his political views. That's why he moved to the Soviet Union, because he admired socialism as a system. He became disillusioned when he saw the reality and came back. But he, at the same time, though, that he was genuinely leftist or socialist in his political views, he spent a lot of time with super conservative, right-wing, anti-Castro types, So he's just one of those people who like to mix it up like that. And I think he mixed it up, and he got caught up in something that was much bigger than he knew.
That's what I think. It's interesting too, because I was reading recently that he may have attended meetings with like college students with Michael Payne when he was in Texas, more leftist type stuff. But then of course he's mixing it up with a guy like Guy Bannister, former FBI right wing John Bircher type dude.
He spoke to students at a Jesuit college in Alabama in the summer of 1963, and talked about his time in the Soviet Union. And the people who saw him there were very impressed with him, like assumed he had a college degree, which he didn't have. He was a political organizer type. He wanted to immerse himself in the action. And, when in New Orleans, when he wants to publicize his pro-Castro activities, he walks into the headquarters of the CIA's favorite young Cubans in New Orleans. So, an uncanny ability to attract CIA attention for somebody who's supposedly unknown.
Yeah, and making that TV appearance, doing the debate, being on the street with the leaflets. It just seems like there was a lot of activities that he immersed himself in, or maybe he was being guided to have a paper trail and a trail that you could go back and look at afterwards. And
it's called creating a legend in intelligence work, and you're creating a reputation. You're creating a persona, and that's what Oswald's time in New Orleans, in his encounters with the CIA-funded group, that's what happened. He gained the public reputation as a Castro supporter. Here's the thing, Mike. People say, "Oh, Lee Harvey Oswald, Castro supporter." All of the evidence, all of it, every bit of the evidence that was produced that Oswald was a Castro supporter after his arrest on November 23rd, 1963, all of that information came from the AMSPEL program. It came from a CIA-sponsored propaganda program. There was no other conduit for that information. It all came from the Cuban Student Directorate, which was secretly funded by George Joannides, and the CIA.
Sure.
So that's what we've learned. That's what we've learned in recent years.
That's earth-shattering. That's earth-shattering.
Yeah, no. And so people say, "Well, Jeff, what's your theory?" I'm like, I don't know. I was in kindergarten when it happened. Leave me alone. Shouldn't the CIA have to answer that question, not me?
Yeah.
What's going on? Oh no. And so that's where we're at. And Trump realized this is something that could work for him politically. But can we break the impasse? It's very difficult. It's very difficult.
I always thought the quote was interesting. I think it was Senator Richard Schweitzer said Oswald has the fingerprints of intelligence all around him, And I think that's a great summation.
And here's the thing. Schweiker said that in 1976.
Right.
Yeah. All of the information we have found many more fingerprints than Schweiker even knew about. The declassified Oswald file. Schweiker didn't know about that.
Do you have any information about who it was that took the photograph of Oswald allegedly on the bus after supposedly fleeing the book depository? This is supposedly a photograph taken by a military intelligence guy who was on his day off hanging around Dealey Plaza. Have you heard that story?
I have not heard that story or seen that photograph. If you want to share it with me, I'll check it out.
Yeah, I'll see. I forget his name, but I mean, there's he's been interviewed, and I always thought that was interesting. He gets on a bus and then gets off the bus and then supposedly goes to the cab stand, and then it's just his movements that day too. I mean, that could be a whole other episode, but
this story, Mike. So there's a photograph. Have you seen the photograph?
I have seen the photograph. Yeah.
Okay. And so is that Oswald in the photograph?
Well, it's just it's just a bus. You don't even see. There's no proof that Oswald was on the bus in the photograph.
Oh, so it's a photograph of the bus on the outside.
Yeah, it's a photograph of the bus, and I'll look into that and send that to you. But I was always confounded by that.
It's one of those. It's one of those stories that's. I mean, it's uncheckable. There's no way to corroborate it. So those kind of things I just put aside and say, I don't know.
Right. That's like the informant who said he bumped into Jack Ruby before and said, "Oh, are you hanging around for the fireworks?" Yeah. That came out not that long ago too. It was supposedly an FBI informant who I think had a criminal background. So it's like, do you really trust his word? There's a lot of that in this story where a lot of the murky figures from New Orleans or Dallas or certain witnesses had maybe criminal backgrounds or certain connections that the waters can be muddied.
Yeah.
When dealing with their testimony. But what do you make of Ruth and Michael Payne? I know there's been a lot written about them. Did you delve into them during your research, or is that an area that you've more or less stayed away from, or?
It's a good question, and maybe I should know more about it. I mean, why are people interested in Ruth Payne? Well, she and her husband were fairly left-wing, but they also had family connections to the CIA. And, knowing how the CIA works, that's exactly the kind of cutout that you would like to work through. Now, Ruth Payne is still alive, and she denies this and says the government's story is accurate, and there's no reason to, doubt anything. And so, I don't have any information to say she's lying, but she had a cooperative attitude or impulse towards the CIA, and she's right at the heart of the Oswald story. So, but, that said, I don't think we need to indict Ruth Payne to understand that the government's story isn't true.
Right.
Ruth Payne may be innocent and have nothing to do with it. That's possible.
That's true. Yeah.
So that's where I leave it.
Yeah. And you also had a chance, I think it was in the 90s, to interview Marina Oswald. Can you go through that experience a little bit and tell us about that? And I think maybe 9 or 10 months ago, you found that tape and you kind of digitized it and released it.
Yeah. So this is a story that people can listen to on my JFK Facts on Substack. Yes, I interviewed Marina Oswald back in the 90s when I was a reporter at the Post. And, Mike, I had totally forgotten about this. I truly had forgotten about this. And I was cleaning out my office. I was moving and I was reorganizing all my files. And I opened up this box. It had all the cassette recordings of different interviews I'd done over the years. And there was these 3 cassettes that said Marina Oswald, some date in 1996. And I was like, the whole story came back to me. And this was the story. So I was working at the Post. I was very interested in JFK. And I was starting I did a story about Win Scott, the station chief in Mexico City, who later became the subject of my first book, Our Man in Mexico, which you can buy on JeffersonMorleyBooks.com. And so I was very interested, and I contacted Marina Oswald. And she had been in the news recently. She had, after Oliver Stone's movie come out, she had gone on Tom Brokaw, NBC News, and Oprah Winfrey, top-rated national news shows. And so I called her and we talked, and I was trying to establish a rapport with her, but I thought, if I can establish a rapport with her, then I'll go out and interview her in person, and then I can really ask my questions. So I'm calling up to just, get acquainted, get a feel for her, with this eye towards I'm going to do an interview down the road. So I talked to her a few times, and it's right at this time. My reporting on JFK did not make me popular at the Washington Post.
I can imagine.
So it was at this time that a friend of mine came to me and said, Jeff, I was like, I'm gonna go see Marina Oswald. I'm gonna get this hot interview. And a friend of mine, good friend at the paper, said, Jeff, you are not gonna write any more about JFK, and we're not gonna talk about it. Okay. It's just the decision's been made and you need to know it. Okay. And at that point, you get a message like that in a professional organization. I had to back off. I had to stop. Right. I didn't have the option of doing the story that I wanted to pursue. And I could say it was a great story and how dare you suppress me and all of that. But I wasn't interested in picking a fight. I had a good job. And so I just had to let it go. It was like, I work for an organization. The organization's made a decision, so be it, So I had to let it go, and I totally forgot about it until these tapes tumbled out 30 years later, or 28 years later. And so I played the interview with Marina Oswald, and you can find it. Marina Oswald has one last thing to say, and that headline is accurate. Marina Oswald Porter has not talked since then. She still lives in the Dallas area. I got in touch with her through a friend who knows her and said, I found this tape of yours. I don't know if you remember that we talked, and I'm going to run it. And I just want you to know that, that I'm going to do that. And if you have anything to add, please let me know and I'll include it. And I got word back. She said, I'm not interested in commenting. That's a different period in my life, and I'm not talking about that anymore. I understood that totally. She's been badly treated by the press, and I understand her decision to avoid further involvement. But it's a very fascinating story. And, the gist of the story is she doesn't believe that her husband killed the president. I mean, she was kind of browbeaten into saying that at the time in 1964, which you can imagine. A foreign-born woman, your husband's accused of killing the most heinous crime. You're completely helpless. She has two little kids. Of course she's going to say anything to keep herself safe. But with the passage of time, and as she says in the interview, it was about my kids. I couldn't not tell the truth because of my kids. The kids had to know the truth about their father. And I really admired that in her, And for all the scorn she got, it was so wrong. It was so unfair. I mean, it's fine. You don't believe her. She should have been treated with respect, and wouldn't a wife know, or have some insight, better than Arlen Specter? Yeah, probably.
yeah. Or even Ruth Payne, I have to say.
I think
other than Marina, I think Ruth Payne gave the most testimony to the Warren Commission. That made Oswald look like a lone nut.
The Warren Commission glommed on to people who reinforced their predetermined conclusion handed down by President Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover in writing the weekend before the assassination. We have both President Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover in writing within 48 hours of Kennedy's murder saying this guy Oswald did it alone, and that's what we're going to find. And that's what the Warren Commission found, 9 months later, 10 months later.
And I'm pretty sure they threatened her with deportation back to the Soviet Union as well. And she had, Secret Service men skulking around. They kept her in a hotel for months, I think. I mean, what was she, like 20? She would have been in her early to mid 20s at this time. So I can't even imagine what that was like.
Yeah. Yeah, no, she was totally vulnerable. So she could be manipulated into saying anything. But, within 5 years, when the public attention was off and she'd studied the case, well, really 10 years, she told me. It was really in the mid 1970s when she began to familiarize herself with the JFK research and what had been learned about her husband, that she really came to this firm conclusion that Lee had not killed the president.
Isn't that when Patricia McMillan kind of worked on a book with her, I think?
Yeah, Priscilla Johnson McMillan.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Priscilla. Yeah,
wrote
Lee and Me or something.
Marina and Lee, a best-selling portrait. And the interesting thing about Priscilla McMillan that we now know that we didn't know before was that she was and I'm not speaking in any way pejoratively, a quote unquote witting collaborator of the CIA. And we have the document that now says Priscilla Johnson was a witting collaborator of the CIA in 1964. And 12 years later, she surfaces and writes a book that says the CIA was right. Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. So,
yeah. Was she the young journalist that interviewed Lee when he was in Russia? Is that the same person?
Yeah. That's how Priscilla Johnson came to the attention of the CIA.
Bizarre.
She was a graduate of Harvard, a Russian speaker, and she was working as a reporter at a wire service in Moscow, and wrote stories about Oswald's defection. So, another way in which the CIA influenced perceptions around the JFK story, in an indirect but real way.
Yeah, it's interesting. Marina, who she ended up marrying later, Ken Porter, worked for the CIA-connected company Collins Radio. They had a lot of those contracts.
I attach no significance to that.
With the Collins Radio. Well, not just that connection, but the thing that Collins Radio was interesting to me is Carl Mather, his car being in Oaks Bluff there around the time that Tippit was killed, and he was friends with Tippit, and someone spotted his car and reported his license plate. So I feel like that's never really been, as far as Collins, I agree. I put more significance into not the Porter connection necessarily, but the Carl Mather one. Are you familiar with that one?
I'm not. What's the story there?
So Carl Mather was an employee of Collins Radio, and they were let go from work that day, probably around 1:00. And he was never officially interviewed. His wife was interviewed. But according to that story, he was just hanging out in his car, near where Officer Tippit was killed. And he never really denied it. And he's never offered an explanation for why he was over there. This was a place, I think, that was 45 minutes away from where he worked at Collins Radio. Mm-hmm. So I guess it's kind of a loose end. I mean, I'm not saying I'm just saying it's another interesting connection to intelligence.
Yeah.
Around the whole thing.
Yeah.
So whether he was waiting to meet with somebody or why was he over there,
or maybe it had nothing to do with anything.
Or it could be nothing. I mean, it's similar to Oswald's behavior, like in the movie theater. Like the research I've looked at, I'm convinced that Oswald went into the movie theater not long after the feature had started, not long after 1:00. So that puts him at odds physically with being over where Tippit was shot. So I think that's another, the person who worked at the movie theater says, well, no, Oswald came in here shortly after 1:00 and bought a ticket, didn't sneak in. So just another piece of information that's interesting when you're looking at the larger thing. But some more information that did come out under Trump was stuff about the Secret Service. Have you looked at any of Vince Palamara's recent stuff about that? That's interesting.
Yeah, I had Vince on the JFK Facts podcast a couple of weeks ago, and people can find that on my Substack. I mean, what was interesting about Vince's piece about the so-called Chicago plot, and I should say Vince Palamara is a citizen researcher, but really, I would say, for me, my go-to guy on the Secret Service. He's
Definitely
interviewed practically every Secret Service officer who was, around in 1963. He's checked their statements. He's really done a lot of impressive research, better work than any academic historian has ever done on the subject. So Vince's latest book about the Chicago plot, an apparent conspiracy to assassinate President Kennedy 3 weeks before he goes to Dallas, 1st of November 1963, when he cancels a scheduled trip to Chicago. So Vince's new book is based on a lot of what has come out in the past, under Trump and Biden. But I tell you a couple of things that impressed me most about Vince's reporting. First, the number of Secret Service agents who told Vince that they believed President Kennedy had been killed by a conspiracy. I mean, Vince can quote a dozen Secret Service agents to that effect. Okay? That's significant. I think my personal feeling is that one of the realities that the Kennedy assassination shows us is that President Kennedy's stand on civil rights in particular, which became much more aggressive, I guess, in the summer of 1963 when he endorses the Civil Rights Act, which was something he had declined to do for 2 years, much to the frustration of this, Martin Luther King and the rest of the civil rights movement. Kennedy didn't lift a finger for them. But in June of 1963, he finally comes out in favor of the Civil Rights Bill. One thing that the story of Abraham Bolden really shows is Kennedy's support for civil rights really cost him among law enforcement. And in the ranks of the Secret Service and the ranks of the Dallas police, there was widespread, I would say almost uniform hostility to President Kennedy because of civil rights. These law enforcement types were used to the old order, the Jim Crow order, whether in the South or, sort of a less formal type of segregation in the North, but still, a reality of systematic, second-class citizenship for Black people in the eyes of CIA, of law enforcement. They have less rights. Their rights are less respected. They're suspected more easily. Everything about it. And when you see what Abe Bolden talked about, that was a reality, and that was part of the failure of the breakdown of presidential security in Dallas.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. And Bolden's book, Echoes from Dealey Plaza, is definitely a must read for anybody interested into that aspect of it. And he's still around. I think he's almost 90 years old. And thankfully he's still around.
Yeah.
And
if people want to check him out on Facebook, he's still posting every once in a while. So
he's a great man. Yeah. We had him on the program.
So Mike, I think I'm going to have to wrap it up now, but this has been a great conversation. And, like I say, we've got a lot of news developments coming. So, we can do it again when we know more about what's going on with Trump. And
I would love to, Jeff. We didn't even get into Mexico City. That can almost be its own episode, but we are almost at 8:00. So that is the editor of JFK Facts on Substack, author of 3 books about the CIA with a lot of connections to the assassination. And we'll certainly, we can talk about those books. You got the goods on Richard Nixon. You got the goods on Joanides. You got the goods on Win Scott. I mean, it's never ending.
Yeah. Let's do it again.
Yeah, it was an honor to have you on. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you everybody for listening. We'll see you next time.